The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon. This is Frosty Walker, Information Security Officer for Texas Education Agency, and welcome to the second in a series of webinars regarding cybersecurity for the fall semester of 2018. Today we'll be covering how to build an incident response exercise. Practice, practice, practice. We hope you find these informative. We will allow time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. Should you have a question during the presentation, please feel free to submit them and we'll get them queued up for the Q&A answer session. If someone would please just drop me a note and let me know if the audio is clear, and also if there are any questions regarding the visual of my slides. I would appreciate that very much. As we're waiting on someone to respond, I would appreciate the opportunity to talk just briefly about the Data Security Advisory Committee, which provides guidance to the Texas education communities, maximizing collaboration and communication regarding information security issues and resources which can be utilized within the educational community served. If someone would please drop me a note. It looks like if anyone can see that, please just drop me a note. We may be having some technical difficulties here. Okay, well, the DSAC is currently comprised of representatives from school districts, ESCs, TEA, the private sector, and of course the team is diverse both in size and geographically, and willing to share ideas, needs, and time to hopefully provide solutions for everyday cybersecurity issues. I want to take the opportunity to thank everyone that sits on that committee and works with me to review the information that we share in the webinars, as well as the information that we share in the in our portal as well. So So I haven't seen anybody respond back. We are recording all of our webinars, and as soon as we can get this posted, it takes about a week for us to get those posted up on the portal, which can be found at Texas Gateway, https://www.texasgateway.org under Cybersecurity Tips and Tools. And if you go to that URL, you will see in the center of that URL featured resources that include cybersecurity data, cybersecurity tips and tools. So as I said, today we're going to talk about how to build an incident response exercise that you can conduct in your school, in your district. You'll be able to scale that down to an exercise. So hopefully we'll be able to give you some ideas and some concepts of what you need to be doing in order to put together an exercise. And then we're actually going to build a playbook or a script on how that an exercise would flow, and some of the things that you need to consider. And then we'll look at gap analysis, some of the things that you would look at to make sure that you can complete those in a timely manner. So one of the key things anytime we're doing an exercise, we want to clearly define this as an exercise. We can put exercise, 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 or practice, practice, practice. Any of those two will work in the communications, but anything in writing, we want to make sure that we emphasize this is an exercise. And so when we're looking at exercises, in this case, we're going to take an application for the exercise today. We want to look at something that's publicly facing and potentially contains sensitive information. And of course, we're going to have to look at a potential method of compromise. And when we're talking about applications, one of the couple of the easier ways that applications are often compromised is either compromised credentials, user ID and password, or through an application vulnerability. So either one of those work fine when we're dealing with an exercise based around an application. For today's exercise, we're going to use a publicly facing application that does contain sensitive information. We're going to use compromised credentials. We really won't get into how those credentials were compromised or where those credentials were compromised. That's something that we really won't cover in this particular. We're not talking about forensics necessarily on how that happened. But we're also going to use international logins at unusual times. And the reason that we do that, particularly if this is the first exercise that you've done, we want to choose a method that is fairly easy for your teams or your individuals that you work with, your application team, your network teams, that they can potentially look to see if we can share that type of information. So when we start this exercise, the first thing we have to talk about is an alert notification. And if you had joined us last month, we talked about different types of communication involved in a cyber incident. And one of those indeed was the alert notification, or how someone that detects an anomaly in your application would be able to notify you. Now, if that's an internal person, it may be easy for them. They pick up the phone and call the IT department and let them know, hey, I'm seeing an anomaly. But we also have external users that can give us an alert notification. And we want to make sure that if our users notice an anomaly, that they can contact someone to say, hey, I'm seeing an anomaly. You may want to take a look at this application. So in this case, we're going to use an alert notification. It's going to come from our application team that detects a high volume of traffic during non-peak hours of operation with hundreds of successful logins, and they notify the security team or the information security officer. Once that notification is received, it will activate an incident security response plan, and that means we'll engage our incident response team. And if you don't have a written guidelines for that, I recommend that you go to our Texas portal, texasgateway.com, and there is an incident response team red book that was written by the Texas Department of Information Resources. It was just updated earlier this year or late last year. And it is a wealth of information when it comes to incident response. It is a template. It's in a Word document, so you can tape, and it has a template for you to add people to your incident response team. It has a template that you can add for the notification process. And on page 12, it has a checklist for triage. So I like to use that book. Anytime I have an incident response, we open up that book, we begin to document, and once we've activated our incident response team. Once we've activated that response team, we're actually, in this case, we're probably going to have some external and internal users. and we need to verify whether or not they may have logged in using international IPs during unusual hours. Fairly easy, once again, to check with our internal users, but a little bit more difficult on how you would check with your external users. Oftentimes when I've used this exercise, I get, well, of course, I was asleep. But when you're dealing with external users, and you may not want to, let them know you're doing an investigation, but you may want to ask an external user if they've been traveling lately to a foreign country, and see if they will give you an answer with that. If you have to contact your external users to find out if their ID may have been used from an international IP in unusual hours. And once we find out that we've had some successful logins from, and we've validated that they are indeed from international IP addresses, we're going to have to make a decision. And that decision is not going to be made by the incident response team. That is going to be made by your leadership. So you're going to have to take your findings, and you're going to have to make a decision. Someone is going to have to make a decision on whether we're just going to disable those user IDs that we saw logging in, or are we going to take this whole application out of service until we can determine what actually is happening, what's going on. So those are two of the potential options that you might have to take a look at. And again, that is not the incident response team. They're just providing information. Yes, we've seen successful logins from unusual hours from international IP addresses. Take that to leadership and let them make that decision. Leadership decision is really going to be based around, is the application safe to continue operation, or do we need to suspend the availability? And their decision is going to be based on the information that the incident response team is going to provide them. So the incident response team has to be very clear in what they're seeing. And of course, if we write this information down, we want to make sure we include the words exercise, 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 or practice, practice, practice. And the reason, particularly if we're sending a notice by email, we want to be careful, because from time to time we have public information security, public information requests, and oftentimes those are searched on by keywords. A keyword could pop up, and if it doesn't have exercise, 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 could potentially be exposed that you had an incident when you were really just doing an exercise. So I strongly encourage you to document everything with exercise, 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 or practice. So in this case, for today's exercise, we're going to take the application out of service. And of course, we're going to notify our users that it's out of service. And we probably, most of y'all have a process to do that. And maybe even a standard language that says we have a unscheduled outage. We're working on the issue. We're trying to resolve that issue. We'll keep we'll keep you as users updated as to when it's going to be available. But you should have some type of process on how to notify your users for an unscheduled outage. But again, particularly since we're dealing in this case with both external and internal communications, you want to make sure you do have a process for that. And we're going to continue with practice, 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 exercise, exercise, exercise. We'll continue that investigation. And we're going to ask our application team to determine from the application logs if they can provide information as to what, let's say 100 users that were successfully logged on, what did they actually access? Can we tell from our logs what they actually access? And this will help us narrow the scope of our potential exposure. And of course, we're going to have to deal with a communication again to our leadership based on the scope of the exposure. So if our application logs can tell us, here's what information those users accessed during the time they were logged on, and if there was sensitive information that was potentially exposed in an unauthorized exposure, or if we don't have the information that we can detect that from in the logs, do we have to look at a potential exposure of the complete data set? The complete data set being whatever that user ID actually has access to. And you multiply that times 100 or so, how many ever user IDs you've actually had successful logins. So you can see where the value of having an application logging that can actually tell you that information can be a real asset in a situation such as this, in a cybersecurity incident, rather than have to look at a potential exposure of the whole data set. So those are some of the things that we're going to take a look at. And of course, we're still going to continue our exercise. If we determine that there was potential unauthorized exposure, or in fact, we know that those users access sensitive information, we are now in a data breach situation in which we are going to have to send a notification. And we're going to, once again, that decision on the best notification method, this will be up to leadership. But Texas Business and Commerce Code, Chapter 521.053 is fairly clear about when you need to notify on a data breach or a potential unauthorized exposure. So you'll want to consult that legislation potentially and review that as to how to determine the best notification method and whether or not you do need to notify. And once again, you'll find all of that type of information in the Incident Response Red Book. Another thing that your leadership is going to need to talk about is, will we provide credit monitoring for those users that are impacted by potential exposure or a data breach? So we're going to have to talk about, credit monitoring. Somebody is going to have to reach out to credit monitoring companies, see how much that's going to cost. All of that actually takes time when you're in a real live situation. So hopefully, when you exercise and you practice this, you'll at least look up phone numbers and you'll have it documented, the different companies that provide those services. So if that decision is made, you can reach out to someone there and you're not just looking through the internet trying to find someone that can help you. I know that the Department of Information Resources is currently looking at trying to add someone that provides credit monitoring service to a contract so that they would have that readily available, but currently that's not available. And another thing that you want to practice is the draft for your media notification. So if you've had a potential unauthorized exposure or a data breach, you're going to need to notify the media, and you're going to need to, in that communication, and we talked about this in last month's a webinar, what all you need to include in that. You want to be very precise as to what happened, what you're doing to resolve the issue. You'll want to know, you'll let the media know that it's an ongoing investigation. So you don't want to just come out and say, here's a whole bunch of data. You want to be very concise as to what you're sharing with the media in that communication. So I personally have my communications team has a draft letter that is a template that we can change a few things up depending on what the situation would be, so that we have at least a base of what we need to know, what we need to include in that media communication. And once again, that there's information about that in the incident response red book, as well as a sample for the data breach notification for your users that may have been impacted. So again, that's a very valuable resource if you don't already have a resource such as that. So we kind of get some idea of some of the things that are going to happen in this exercise, but we want to put those into what we refer to as a playbook. What we typically do when I'm doing an exercise like this is I write up the playbook, and I take that first to my IT, my technology leadership, and explain what we're wanting to do. Within the playbook, we talk about some of the things that we're going to be doing. If we're going to ask their teams to spend extra time working on this exercise, I even include a general estimate of the number of hours that it will take to do that. So those are some of the things that I've included in our playbook that we're going to go through. And you'll notice that the playbook is also listed starting with day one. I do not like to try to do an exercise like this in 4 hours or a full day. The reason for that is if you're going to have an exercise which you have a lot of teams involved, including your leadership, you have to be considerate that they have jobs that they need to take care of. So if you spread an exercise over multiple days, it makes it easier for them to work your exercise into their schedule. So I think that that's something that, again, we just talk about that with our leadership. Sometimes with my IT leadership, they go, well, I don't think we can do that. Well, let's try it and see what happens. If we can or we can't, then we know we have a gap, and when we do a gap analysis. So we're going to go through our exercise playbook, and once again, as you can see, it is marked exercise only, no external communications. We want to make sure that anything that's in writing, once again, has, exercise only, exercise, practice, so draft, any of those things that help it readily be identified that it is not a real live situation. You can start this in the middle of the morning. You can start it first thing in the morning. I just chose that we're going to start it at noon. And as we talked about, our application team reports higher than normal volume activity on application X during off-peak hours, and they report that to the security team. And one of the things that we're looking for here is your application team, can they determine the issue from the application logs? And do they review logs on a regular basis? And that might not be your application team. That could be, you could aggregate all your logs into some type of an automated log system, and it may look for anomalies. So you have to kind of take a look at how you do your business when you're writing something like that. But if you've got an application team and they review logs on a regular basis, then you could certainly include this. Now, once they've reported this to the security team then is now going to open up an incident response red book, an event, and they're going to start a deep dive. On my incident response team, I name a lot of different people, but I certainly have different people from each of my unique IT divisions. So I have multiple names on there for my application team, for my network team, my operations team, even my tool team. And so that allows me to pick and choose individuals. I don't need everybody in the room all at once. We may get to that point, but I can start off with a smaller response team, and as we need to add additional folks or we need to ask for additional resources, it's available to the response team. Now, so the security team opens a response, and potentially, you know, we talked about looking at the red book as a guideline, or your incident response plan as a guideline. And one of the key things that I always like to do in any situation is anytime we open up an incident response event, a red book, I want to notify my IT director, my chief information officer, my IRM, whatever title they have, the department, the information head for your IT services. And I typically notify them not through email, but with a phone call. I ask or a text message, instant message, or an email saying, would you stop by my office? So I want to talk to them face to face. I like having that communication. And all that we're going to be able to share with them at this time is that we're looking at a potential information security issue. We're not, we don't have any information at this time, but we're indeed looking at a potential information security issue, cybersecurity incident, and we'll keep them informed as we progress. I personally like to update those folks approximately every 2 hours if it continues to go on in a real incident, just so that we keep them informed. The last thing that you want is you don't want to go knowing about that you have a potential incident for 12 hours and then let someone know we have a problem. So you want to let them know early. So you want to get that in your practice as well. Now, in addition to our application team, in this case, our network team also notifies the information security officer of a high volume of activity, an anomaly on the firewall logs, to an IP address for application X from offshore IP addresses between midnight and 4 a.m. So those logs are a little more specific as to they're able to identify your international IP addresses and a better time frame than potentially just your application logs. Now, the incident response team is going to then turn back around to the network team and ask their assistance in reviewing the firewall logs between midnight and 4 a.m. for activity from offshore addresses to see if there are other applications that may be seeing similar patterns of behavior or other anomalies. So you're seeing one anomaly with your offshore IP addresses logging in at unusual times, and the application team is telling you that they're seeing successful logins. That could still be a distraction. Malicious actors oftentimes create distractions to disguise what they're actually trying to do. So we want to ask our network team to look for any other anomalies. Go back and take a look to see in the last 12 hours, do you see any other anomalies that may not be quite as glaring as just international IP addresses? And here I've estimated that would take 2 full-time employee hours. Does that mean one person for 2 hours? Yes. Or is that two people for 1 hour? They can determine how they want to do that. But I want them to go back and look at their logs to see if they can detect any anomalies. Even though this is an exercise, have them look at the logs so that again, we're going to do we have a standard procedure for looking at our firewall logs and review? Are we looking for anomalies such as offshore IP ranges that can be identified or other anomalies that might exist. So those are some of the things that you would be looking for in that step of the exercise. So we're still in day 2. We're an hour and a half, 2 hours in, and in real life we're probably talking longer than that. But in the exercise, we're an hour and a half into the exercise, and the information response team asks the application team to verify if the higher volume of activity maps to the time frames identified by the network team. So now we're going to take and look at how we're looking between the application logs and the firewall logs. And hopefully we have some type of synchronization on time across all of our devices. And that will make it much easier for us as we begin to do a deeper dive or forensics into our logs and be able to match up and say, yes, this appears during the same time frames. We see IP addresses on the firewall logs. We see successful logins during that match up during those time frames. So, and again, the response team will turn around and they've notified us that they confirmed over 100 users authenticated on application X during those same time frames. So now the incident response team is able to match up those firewall logs with the application X logs to confirm that application X users logging on during normal off-peak activity hours from offshore accounts. And we think that'll take about an extra 4 hours for the incident response team. But you've got multiple people working on it, so you could probably do that in an hour or so. But do you have the ability to do this type of comparison of logs across multiple platforms, synchronized time? So later in the day, the incident response team contacts some of the end users to see if they logged into application X during the peak hours from offshore addresses. And the users indicate that they were home asleep between midnight and 4 a.m. And again, that's going to take some extra time if you're contacting users. And again, what you're looking for is, do you have the ability to reach out to those users? Do you have an email? Do you have a phone number? Are they in the office? How do you contact those folks? You want to look to see if you have that type of information available for your users. So we're going to get an update from the information security officer, advises the chief information officer of the issue, and now we're going to recommend that we take application X offline until the cause is determined. If we determine that someone is logging in at unusual hours using someone else's credentials, we know that we have unauthorized access to a system. We don't know who it is or what's going on, but at least we know we have an issue, and you're going to make a recommendation to take that offline, or as we mentioned earlier, you recommend to disable those users' accounts. And you are not, the incident response team is not going to be able to make that decision. So in this case, I have my chief information officer set up a one-on-one meeting with the executive leadership to advise the issues and discuss taking application X offline and any other applications that you might have found anomalies. Remember, we asked the network team to look at anomalies. Well, if you wanted to include that in your exercise, you could include that. In this case, we're only going to deal with one application for today in this exercise, but it's certainly there that you could include multiple applications. Now, and of course, we talked about having a unscheduled outage notification for your end users. with a standard notification process. And you should have someone that's authorized to send that note out. They need to be contacted, and then they distribute that note. If you don't have that process and it's not documented, we need to make sure that we document that. So we've taken the application offline. We know we've got an issue, but we need to determine what was accessed. So the incident response team provides a list of application X user IDs that were authenticating between midnight and 4 a.m. to the application team to see if they can determine what data these users accessed in application X during those time frames. So we're looking for potential unauthorized access of sensitive information. And again, I've estimated that could take application logs, and reviewing those logs sometimes takes a long time. So I've allocated approximately 4 hours of man hours in order to do that, full FTE equivalents in order to do that. And again, that's to just let our IT division team know in this exercise how much time their people be dedicating to that resource. But again, we talked about this, so the potential review of the application logs to see if you can extract information from those logs, or if there are other ways you can determine what was accessed. And oftentimes there are other ways to tell, but you need to look at those. And we'll talk about some of the remediations as we look at our gap analysis in a little bit. Now, on the second day, we're in the afternoon. Remember, this is taking a while to look at those logs. The application confirms that the user IDs listed did access sensitive information during off-peak hours. So we have now confirmation of unauthorized access of sensitive information. And so we're going to have to call another executive meeting with our leadership, and we're going to have to notify them that we've had and been able to confirm that we've had access to, we choose a number here, 1,000 sensitive records that have potentially have been exposed to unauthorized access. And so in that meeting, once again, just like we're talking about the media, we're going to try to stay with the facts. You want to have a discussion with them, and you want to determine, help them or determine what your next steps are. And you should have that documented, once again, in an information security, an incident response plan. But if you need help with that, take a look at that incident response red book. So we've now met with our leadership, and we have told them that we've had unauthorized access for about 1,000 sensitive records. In addition to meeting with the executive teams, we're also going to need to talk to our data owners. So typically within different divisions, there are people that are identified as data owners. And anytime, I use data owners. If I'm going to give someone access, I have to request from the data owners that they get, do they need access? How do they access it? Well, in this case, our data owners need to know what's going on. We need to make sure that we can explain to them what's happened, and that they'll be involved in the approval process of the notification letter after it's been reviewed by legal counsel. That should be a fairly short meeting. Once again, in this practice, we want to, in this exercise, we want to contain the number of people that know what's going on at first, just like you would in a real incident, until we determine all of everything that's happened and we're ready to make a public notification to the media. we may not want everybody to know what we're looking at. So we want to keep that group as small as possible, but inform those that need to be informed of what's going on. Once we realize that we have, now we need to know, how do we contact those folks? Do we have, and what type of contact information do we have? Can we send them an old-fashioned letter with a postage stamp on it? Do we have a current address? Do we have a current email address? How are we going to determine how we notify those folks? So your IT will verify that we have that contact information of the users from different applications or from application X in this case. But oftentimes, contact information to notify those that have been impacted is very difficult. It may not be up to date. So you may think about, well, maybe we'll just post a website that people can go and look and see if they're, so there's some options out there as to how you notify your exposed or your impacted users. You're going to have to ask your communications team to draft that media release regarding unauthorized exposure for approximately 1,000 sensitive records. And you're going to let them know that this is an ongoing investigation. You're going to let them know the steps that you're doing to correct the issue. You may let them know that you've contacted the local authorities, the police. Putting together that piece of information, even if you have a draft, can sometimes take a while because you want to make sure that you're being very concise as to what you're doing. So, I allow my communications team, up to 4 hours for this exercise to do that. Now, notification. In this case, we're in day 2. We're kind of trying to wrap this up in 2 days. A lot of times I stretch an exercise out into 3, but we're going to notify our end users that application X is going to be available tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and we're going to force everyone to change their password. So we're not just going to force those people that we think may have credentials that were compromised, but we're going to ask everybody. And the reason for that is we don't know where that list of where those credentials came from. So there may be a larger list than what we're already dealing with. So the best thing to do is force a change password for everyone on that application. And if you do that, you may need to set up a special help desk. Sometimes users doing self resets have problems. So you may have to set up a special 800 number or an email where they can contact and get that. So you need to take a look at what the possibility of that in your exercise and how you would go about doing that. Now, your exposure notification process is going to continue at the end of day 2, but we know that that's not going to get resolved this afternoon. It's going to take at least 2 weeks. By the time, if you've made a decision to provide credit monitoring, then you're going to have to, how do I include that information? You're going to have to go, actually deal with contacting a credit monitoring service company, and they will provide you the information that you need to include in your letter. If you're going to do that, you want to include that. You only want to send one notification to your impacted folks with this. So you want to make sure you've got all that information included in one document. And so that's going to take a little bit of time. But again, when you practice that, at least you know what kind of process it is. And again, I have a draft notification that's set up, and I have one that is set up with credit monitoring, and I have another template that's set up without, so that we have some type of reference to start with when we start dealing with the breach notification. And with that, you say, well, my exercise is over, but not quite. Because now that we've gone through those steps, we want to take and analyze and look for gaps in what we might not be able to provide in a smooth situation. You know, for example, can our application or our network team detect high volumes of traffic and after hours? Do we have the ability to see those anomalies readily? And if we don't, what will that cost us to add that capability? So now we're beginning to take this exercise and also work on a potential budget down the road. You know, this would really be helpful in this type of situation. The same thing is true with your network team. Can they analyze the traffic from international IP addresses? And are they reviewing those logs? Or do you need, are there so many logs that you need to look at some type of log application? There's a ton of those out there. Splunk, Snort, logarithms. There's a bunch of those tools out there that aggregate all those logs and help make it a little easier to review those logs. And you might want to take a look at what's the cost of that. You know, can your teams match up the timing in your logs? And that it can be very difficult. Do you have synchronized timing? If you don't, synchronized timing is actually fairly easy to do. If you set up all of your devices to synchronize to one source time. But you know, when we're dealing with different teams that are setting up different devices, oftentimes we don't synchronize that. So we need to take a look at that. Do your application logs indicate what was accessed by those users? Many times applications may not go to that detail in the logs. And so you go, okay, well, am I going to have to rewrite my application? And you may want to take a look at that. You say, well, maybe I'm going to retire. I'm going to decommission this application in 3 years. We're looking at building a new one. We need to add those capabilities to our new application. You know, there's also other things that you could do to remediate the risk, specifically in this case, regarding compromised credentials. You know, could you implement two-factor authentication on your application? At least that would make it much more difficult for credentials to be compromised and someone to be able to log in those applications. So there are some mitigation that you can take without having to rewrite all your applications. Some people say, oh, my users would never accept two-factor authentication. But, you know, I certainly was excited when my bank started requiring me to use two-factor authentication to log into my bank. And it only takes, you know, maybe 5 extra seconds to do that. So those are things that you might want to take a look at. You also want to look at, you know, will your leadership take the application out of service based on findings? You know, did you present a good enough case to your leadership that we need to do something about this? And in an exercise, that seems pretty simple, but oftentimes when we're dealing with those situations in real life, we get people that go, you know, what are our customers going to think? What are our end users going to think? And so those are much more difficult situations than we just think, oh, it's easy. Just take that thing offline for 3 or 4 days or for a week. that's easier said than done. So you have to take a look at that. And if you need to send a breach notification, will you be providing credit monitoring? And that could largely depend upon the scope of your exposure. In other words, how many users are impacted? If I only have to provide that for 1,000, well, that's one cost. But if I have to provide that for 10,000 or 50,000, then that's then we have to weigh those situations. So, on a regular basis, I call the credit monitoring companies and say, "Hey, give me a price quote. If I had a breach, how much would it cost for 10,000? How much would it cost for 50,000? How much would it cost for 10?" At least I have some idea that I can take to my leadership, and I try to keep those numbers current. Just so that, and doing an exercise like this helps you keep that current. So those are some of the gap analysis that you can take a look at with that. And with that, we're going to turn this over. I think we have provided a fairly basic set of both concepts as well as a design of a playbook of how you could write up an exercise for you to do that. If you're looking at doing this and you're having some issues, please feel free to reach out and to me. I would be willing to work with you on that exercise. I do have a question here that's asking about the availability of the slides. While I mentioned that we do record the audio, and this entire webinar will be available, I also put a set of the PowerPoint presentation out on the TexasGateway.org website as a resource. So with that, we'll wait around here a minute. And someone has asked the link to the Red Book. It is at the TexasGateway.org, https // Texas Gateway. I'll pop it back up here in a minute. .org under cybersecurity tips and tools and tips, and all of the attachments, all of the Word or Excel documents are at the very bottom of that spreadsheet, and you can click on those and download those. So they're there on our security tips and tools website. So that's where you can find that. Okay, I was looking here through there. I know we had a little bit of audio problems earlier. I apologize for that. All right, that looks like all of the questions that have come in so far. And it looks like I'm trying to zip through here just to make sure. And I also post all the answers to the questions. So they'll also be posted out on the Gateway portal as well. So with that, I'm going to give you back almost 5 minutes of time today. I appreciate your attention, and thank you very much for giving us and the DSAC the opportunity and your time today. Have a great afternoon, and happy Cybersecurity Awareness Month, October. Thank you all very much.